It must, however, be admitted, in extenuation of their fault, that the spectacle then presented by the earth was far from cheering. The whole economy of the creation was upset. The rivers, diverted from their natural channels.
Note: history has preserved us proofs of this displacing of rivers after the deluge. We read in Strabo, Book 2, that the Araxes, which waters Armenia, was still without a vent, and inundated the country, when Jason, chief of the aeronauts, opened a subterraneous channel, whereby the Araxes flowed into the Caspian Sea. In the famous Chou King of Confucius, the Emperor Yao says that the waters, which had once risen to heaven, still bathed the feet of the highest mountains, and rendered the plains impassable.
Formed immense ponds and putrid marshes in those vast plains, adorned, before the deluge, with the graceful tents of the shepherds. The cedars lay prostrate on the seashore, whilst the spoils of the ocean were found amongst the eternal snows of the loftiest mountains. On every side were seen towers levelled to the ground, and cities silent and in ruins.
Note: the Tower of Babel, so immediately after the Great Deluge, may furnish an idea of the antediluvian architecture. Brick and pitch were the materials used. If this immense tower, as there is every reason to believe, resembled the ancient and famous Tower of Bel in Babylon, it was surrounded by an exterior staircase, on a gentle slope, which wound up to the flat roof, and gave the building the appearance of 7 successive towers.
The ploughshare everywhere notched on bones and rubbish. The avenging hand of an angry god had fallen so crushingly, that man, whose heart still trembled with fear, remembering the risk he had run, was more disposed to fear his sovereign master, with a mighty fear, than to love him with confiding love. He had learned to fear God. He doubted his promises and his goodness. Like the drowning mariner, he eagerly sought around him some helping object, which might interpose between them, and ward off, at need, that just but terrible wrath. Noah had spoken to them of an influential and divine being whose tenderness for men was infinite, and who was to plead their cause before the Eternal, and take upon himself their crimes. But who was that privileged mediator, that powerful advocate? They knew not. The descendants of Shem believed that they had found him, in the stars which cheered their solitary watch.
Note: it is a very ancient notion in the East, that the stars are animated. The Jewish doctors had fallen into this error, although it dated much earlier than their people. Philo said that the stars were intelligent creatures, who had never done, and were incapable of doing, harm. According to the Maimonides, the stars know God, their maker, and also themselves, and their actions are always good and holy. The modern Persians still sacrifice to the angel of the moon,
and which they supposed inhabited by celestial spirits. They engaged those spirits to protect them, and kindled fires in their honor on the mountaintops.
Note: according to Arbechai, the Sabaeans did not adore the sun. They merely kindled fires on the earth to thank God for the luminary, which he lit for them in the heavens, and, looking at the stars, they begged of the angels, whom God had placed therein to keep them in motion, that they might be favorable to them. The fires which are lit in almost every country of Europe, commonly called St. John's fires, or midsummer fires, are a relic of Sabaeism.
This was the origin of Sabaeism, which degenerated into idolatry when the accursed race of Cham, attaching themselves to the material object, adored the fire, the water, the earth, the rustling breeze, and in scornful mockery of the primitive worship, which knew not the use of images, they consecrated to the moon statues of silver, and to the sun statues of gold.
Note: the ancient Arabs, descendants of Cham, regarded Noah with contempt, because he did not make use of images. They consecrated to the moon statues of silver, and others of gold to the sun. They divided metals and climates amongst the stars, and believed that they have great influence on the things consigned to them, and on the images consecrated to them.
In the lapse of time the shades thickened, religions became burdened with rites, the worship of the true God was gradually intermixed with that of the stars and the elements. The invention of hieroglyphics completed the confusion, and the few truths which escaped the overthrow of creeds were mysteriously buried in the depth of the idolatrous fanes, like those sepulchral lamps which burn but for the dead. They were carefully concealed from the multitude.
Note: Plato, speaking of the God who formed the universe, says that it is forbidden to make him known to the people. The books of Numa, written on birch bark, and found in his tomb many ages after his death, were secretly burned as dangerous to polytheism. The Brahmins, who, if some travelers are to be credited, have a sublime idea of the divinity, do, nevertheless, make the Hindus adore the most hideous idols. It is only the true religion that treats men as rational and immortal beings,
which lavished its senseless adoration on stones, trees, rivers, mountains, and on animals, a worship more degrading still, and which ended at last by deifying the very vices and passions. It was then that impostors, speculating on human credulity, either entangled or deliberately broke the slight thread of the patriarchal traditions, and, audaciously substituting memory for hope, grouped around the cradles of their fabulous kings, their false prophets, or their powerless divinities, the wonders of the incarnation of the Word, and the primitive revelations of his high and tragical destiny. This, we think, is the explanation of those analogies which are, at first sight, incomprehensible. Nevertheless, all the heathen nations did not take the mystery of the Messiah as a fact accomplished. The Druids, just before the Christian era, were still raising altars, in the gloomy forests of Gaul, to the Virgin who is to bring forth. The Chinese, instructed by Confucius, who had himself found that oracle in old traditions, expected the Holy One, born of a virgin and Son of God, who was to die for the salvation of the world.
Note: according to the ancient sages of China, says the learned Schmidt, the Holy One, the miraculous man, will renew the universe, change its morals, expiate the sins of the world, die overwhelmed with sorrow and opprobrium, and open the gates of heaven.
In the western regions of Asia, and sent to seek him, by solemn embassy, less than half a century after the death of the man-god, the Magi, on the faith of Zerdhucht, studied the constellations in quest of the Star of Jacob, which was to guide them to the cradle of Christ.
Note: Abulfarages says that Zerdhucht prophesied to the Magi the birth of the Messiah, sprung from a virgin. He added that at the time of his birth, there should arise an unknown star, to guide them to his cradle, and he commanded them to bring presents with them when they went. Shahrastani, a Mussulman author, also relates a prediction of Zerdhucht, respecting a great prophet who was to reform the world, as well in religion as in justice, and to whom kings and princes were to be submissive.
The Brahmins sighed for the glorious avatar, the fabulous incarnation of a Hindu deity, of him who was to purge the world of sin, and begged it of Vishnu, laying on his jeweled altar odorous stuffs of sweet basil, a plant beloved by the Indian god. The haughty children of Romulus, those idolaters by excellence, who had created whole legions of gods, read in the books so jealously and so wisely kept by the Sibyl of Combes, a contemporary of Achilles and Hector, the Virgin, the divine infant, the adoration of the shepherds, the serpent crushed, and the golden age restored to the earth. Finally, about the time of the Messiah, all the nations of the East were in expectation of a future savior, and Boulanger, who was better inspired on his deathbed, after having shown how generally that hope was diffused, illogically calls it a universal chimera.
Note: a unanimous testimony is of the greatest weight, says Bernardine de Saint-Pierre, for all the earth cannot be in one universal error.
But what were those glimmering rays, powerless to dispel the darkness of idolatry, when compared with the blaze of light which illumined the chosen people? We are struck with amazement at sight of that prophetic chain of which the first link was fixed to the cradle of the world, and the last settles down at the sepulchre of Christ.
Note: it is a tradition taught in the synagogue, and recognized by the Church, that all the prophets, without any exception, prophesied only for the time of the Messiah.
The threat of Jehovah to the serpent contains, as we have already said, the first prediction of the Messiah. We have further said, and the Jewish traditions confirm it, that this prediction was more fully explained, in after times, to the exiles of Eden, when they had conciliated heaven by penance. Noah, who was adopted by God as inheritor of the faith, transmitted to Shem his revelations, and Shem, whose life was nearly as long as that of his ancestors, might repeat them to the father of the faithful. Then it was that a mysterious benediction, wherein the promise of the Messiah was contained, made it manifest that the blessed seed promised to Eve should be also the seed and the offspring of Abraham. The primitive traditions were very soon succeeded by the great prediction of Jacob, the expiring patriarch, who has seen in spirit the state of the 12 tribes, when in Palestine, announces to his sons, assembled round his deathbed, that Judah has been chosen, from amongst his brethren, to be the root of the kings of Israel, and the father of that Shiloh so long promised, who was to be the King of kings and the Lord of lords. The coming of Christ is pointed out in a precise manner. He shall arise from amid the ruins of his country, when the Shebet, the scepter, the legislative power, shall rest in the hand of strangers.
Note: Christians apply this revelation of Jacob to the Messiah, and thereby prove to the Jews that he must have come long ago, seeing that for upwards of 1800 years their tribes have been mixed up together, their sacrifice abolished, their government extinct, that they have no longer either territory or princes, and that, wherever they are found, they have to submit to the laws of foreign nations. To evade the force of this argument, the Jews now pretend that the word Shebet, which we translate by scepter, also signifies the rod which chastises the slave, and they take occasion from that, to maintain that, even if this oracle did regard the Messiah, all that they could infer from it is, that their chastisement was to last till his coming, which was to be the signal of their delivery. Finally, they deny that the word Shiloh can be translated by Messiah, but their old books give them the lie. This prophecy is understood of the Messiah in the Talmud, and here is how the paraphrase of Onkelos expounds this passage. Judas shall not be without a supreme ruler, nor without scribes of the sons of her children, till the Messiah come. Jonathan, to whom the Jews assign the first place amongst the disciples of Hillel, and whom they venerate almost as they do Moses, also translates Shebet by principality, and Shiloh by Messiah. The paraphrase of Jerusalem is likewise on that side. Thus the most ancient commentaries, the most authentic, and the most respected amongst the Jews, furnish weapons for their own defeat.
The prophet saved from the waters, who was divinely called to gather and consign to writing the history of the first ages and the ancient traditions of mankind, traditions whose remembrance was still vivid amongst the nations, fails not to lend the weight of his imposing testimony to the prophecy of Jacob. A prophet, says he, speaking to the people of God, shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him you shall hear according to all things, whatsoever he shall speak to you. And it shall be, that even some which will not hear that prophet, shall be destroyed from among the people.
Note: hence comes that hope of a new law, which the Jews expect with the Messiah, a law which they place far above that of Moses. The law which man studies in this world is but vanity, say their doctors, in comparison to that of the Messiah.
Then it is of the Messiah that the synagogue has always understood this text so clear. Saint Philip, without any hesitation, applied it to our Redeemer, when he said to Nathanael, "We have found him who was foretold by the prophets, and of whom Moses spoke in the law, Jesus of Nazareth,